address. So IP address, everybody knows what is IP address. I am not going to explain in detail, but in Google Cloud, mainly we are dealing with the internal IP address, and then we'll have a public IP address. And in Google, there is an option you can bring your own public IP address as well. OK, so then we have a firewall rules. Firewall rules is nothing but just consider if you those who are worked in Azure or AWS, it is nothing but your NSGs, network security group. OK, so firewall rules where you are defining what all the traffic you wanted to allow to your VPC. OK, so what all the incoming traffic and what all the outgoing traffic you wanted to allow to your VPC or your virtual network or your VM. OK, so please remember in Google Cloud, by default, incoming traffic are blocked. OK, so you're not able to send any traffic to the Google VPC. This is a by default, but outgoing traffics are allowed. So whenever you deploy any VM in the VPC, you can access Google, you can access Facebook, whatever it is, because outgoing traffic is allowed. But from other VM or other network, you cannot access the VPC network because incoming traffic is by default blocked. Where in Azure, both incoming traffic as well as outgoing traffic are allowed by default. OK, when you compare it with Azure, this is the difference. Yeah, by default, when you create any VNet, VNet, and then any NSGs, you can see default rule allowed in Azure NSGs. OK, that is the difference. So then in Azure, you have to add a custom rule with the highest priority to block incoming and outgoing. Then you will define the required rules with the lower priorities. OK, but here in Google Cloud, by default incoming traffic, that is which is called as ingress traffics are blocked, and egress, that is outgoing traffics, are allowed. OK, that we'll see in action. OK, how it works. And then routes. OK, so routes is nothing but Google Cloud routes define the path that network traffic takes from a virtual machine instance to other destination. So these destination can be inside your Google Cloud or outside, maybe on-prem. So let's go to our whiteboard. Before that, we'll see our VPC. Yeah, see our VPC is created now. We have a one subnet here, which is hosted in Asia South 1, that is in Mumbai. And this is my IP address. OK, so if I go here, I don't have any firewall policies, and you can see some default routes. I will explain you what is this default route, because route is very important. OK, then we have a subnet and static IP address. We don't have anything. Then if you reserve any static IP address, it will come here. OK, so we don't have any DNS server policy. So DNS server policy is nothing but in Azure, in VNet, you will define custom DNS, right? For example, you wanted to use your own DNS, then you have to define the your DNS server policy here. That we have a separate session there, a slide. So there we will discuss what is DNS policy, because this is very important when you deploy any workloads in Google Cloud. So to understand the DNS concepts. OK, so this is clear, right? So now we have a VPC, and now we are going to talk about firewall. And then OK, let's do one thing. Let's go to our whiteboard. OK, so now we have our VPC. OK, we have a VPC and we have a subnet, which is 10.125.0.0/24. OK, now you deploy one VM here. Maybe the IP address is 10.125.0.2. OK, so this is your Google Cloud GCP. OK, so now you're defining firewall rules here in this VPC. OK, firewall rules. What all the traffic you wanted to allow, and what all the traffic you wanted to incoming traffic you want to allow, and what all the traffic, the outgoing traffic you wanted to allow. As I told you, by default, this is blocked. OK, and by default, the outgoing traffic is enabled. OK, so that you can reach your network, you can reach your Google or any public internet sites from here. Excuse me. Okay, so now let's say you wanted to access, you have an on-prem network here. Okay, so let's say this is your on-premise, that is 10.145.0.0/16 subnet. For example, 16, this is the entire IP range of your on-prem. For example, you wanted to allow RDP to this VM from on-prem. Okay, so then you have to define a firewall policy. Or for example, you have the, let's say here you have your internet, and you have sitting in in internet, and this is your public IP address, for example 125 dot whatsoever. So you wanted to allow from this VM to this VM, you want to take RDP, then you have to define the firewall rules. Okay, so let's see how we are defining the firewall rules. Okay, so for that you need to go to firewall. By default, I'll delete the default network because this will confuse. So just to avoid confusion, I will delete the default network. So at that same time, I'm going to get my public IP address. Okay. So this is my public IP address. So I'll copy, and I want to I want to allow RDP to the VMs which I'm going to deploy it in this VPC. Okay. So for that, I need to go to firewall first. Okay, then let's delete all the default rules. You can see here, right? These rules are applied to the default network which created by default. I'll delete this because to avoid any confusions. Yeah. Okay, it's deleted. Now we have nothing. So I'm going to deploy a firewall rule. Allow RDP. Okay, so I'm going to select the net on my VPC because my VM's gonna deploy it in this VPC. So I have to select the VPC here. And then I need to select ingress. Ingress means incoming. So if I'm doing a RDP, so my network will listen on 3389 port. So it is an incoming traffic for my network. Okay, so I will select ingress. Okay, then I'll select allow. So this is target. Target is nothing but I want, like, do you wanted to apply this to the complete VPC or some specific targets? For example, this is nothing but, for example, you have a VPC here. You have a subnets. In this subnet, you deploy multiple VMs. Okay. This is IP address ending with a 2, and this is IP ending with a 3. So when you define a VPC, sorry, firewall rule, right? So you can select. Okay. So you want to do RDP to only the IP address ending with 3, and you don't want to allow it to others. So there is something called tagging you have to enable in the VM level. So it will apply to only to that particular IP address. Okay, so that you can access RDP to only to that machine instead of entire machine in this VPC. Okay, so here, since this is a test lab, so I'll select just all instance in the network. So it will enable everything. Source IP address. This is my source IP address from where I am coming. Okay, this is my public IP address. Specific port and protocol. So I wanted to allow only 3389. Okay, so let's create the rule. So now from my PC, I can able to take RDP of the Google VM which is deployed in this VPC. So in the next slide we're going to create a VM etc. So that time we'll get the demo. So how it works. Okay, so now you allowed outbound policy. incoming traffic to your VPC on port 83389. If you want to allow, for example, you deploy any VM with IIS or any web server, you have to allow 443 accordingly. Okay, and by default, all the outgoing traffic is allowed. So if you don't want to allow outgoing traffic, then you can create a policy. Okay, block outgoing, block outbound, select egress. Okay, so outbound traffic deny. Okay, so I'm going to deny for everything, and the destination IP, put your subnet IP address on. What all the IP address we defined here, right? That is our 10.125.0.0/24. So these are the subnets. For example, if your VPC having more than one subnet, then if you want to, for example, you have another subnet here, another subnet. This is 10. This is 10.125.0.0/24, the one created. Then you'll have 10.145.0.0/24. So if you want to restrict outbound traffic to only to this one, then just enter the subnet of this. Okay, don't enter this. So if you want to allow everything, so you can allow this. So you can add all the subnets you wanted. Okay, so you just create here and you click deny all protocols. Then create the rule. Okay, I'm not creating in this because I wanted to show the outgoing traffic, etc. Later we can, if needed, we can enable this. Okay, so this is how you create a, or to restrict outbound traffic. By default, it is enabled. Okay, so this is related to firewalls. This is related to subnets and